This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe lure some men to their deaths. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Schulman.
I'm Erin Simpson.
And I'm Rada Iyengar-Plum.
And we are back with another episode where there are too many things in the world for us to cram into one episode, but we will do our very best. I'll start out, as always, with a just singular intro question for us. For this week, because we're moving into September, which means we're kind of moving to the part of the year where we start thinking, oh gosh, I planned to get that done this year and it didn't happen, or I don't know. My question is, what is the hobby that you attempt to really get going every year, and every year it kind of dies or fades out? Erin?
So I think the most accurate answer here is probably plants. I like plants, but I have a balcony. I don't have a proper garden like Lauren or Rada. And so it goes and kind of fits and starts. I have this lime tree that I bought the first year I was in my condo, and it is still growing, and it grows approximately 1 to 3 limes per year. And that's very satisfying every time. But, with travel and everything else, and also it's very windy on a balcony and all of these things, I invest some amount of money at some point in the year, and then some number of things actually continue versus not. So I would say, plants and flowers and balcony things are hope springs eternal. Rada, what about you?
I wish to be the kind of person who crafts, in some soothing way. I do pencil draw. The particular craft varies: cross stitch, pencil drawings. I feel that it would be a soothing evening, relaxing activity that I could do and unwind. And I do it for up to 2 to 3 times, and then I never do it again. So I have a large drawer in my house full of initially started aspirational craft projects, should anyone need those. But maybe next year.
The guest that we will be featuring on this episode has an incredible garden that actually has seasonal flowers come up quarter by quarter. I have so much jealousy of this because mine would be plants, but since you mentioned it, Erin, I will instead say my bullet journal concept.
Yes.
So if you've not done bullet journaling, you start out at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of a job, whatever it is, with this incredibly organized way of orchestrating your to-do list. And it is glorious. If you are a type A person, it is all you ever desired in order to do this. And actually, the 3 of us know somebody who worked with some of us in Office of Secretary of Defense, named Kelly, who has an incredible bullet journal that has colors and illustration and tags and so on. It's amazing. My bullet journal starts out so good, and then I just sort of resort to weird stickies that get lost in my bag and things that say oh, I'll remember that. No, I won't.
Yeah,
and
just lists of lists. There's right.
Right. Yep. And you get to a point where you realize, I definitely meant to do a whole lot of stuff and I forgot for a while. So I should reset on my bullet journal. So, as we move into the beginning of the school year, it's time to start afresh. So maybe we can all pick these up again. It's time for us to get on our crafting and our gardening and our bullet journals. But with that in mind, we'll move quickly into the things that are keeping us occupied on the cocktail party circuit right now, into It's a Drill, where we talk through gossip, current events, small things that are stuck on our minds as we move into the bigger institutional challenges in this episode. I will start with mine, which is within the last week and a half or so, the president has appointed a new national chief design officer and set up a national design studio. And let me say this should be something that people who have my background and my career and my focus on improving customer experience and outcomes to the American people, we should love this, but we do not. And that's sort of crazy making. But here's the reason we should love this is design is something that is meant to improve outcomes, experience, to be curious, to be iterative, to make it so anytime you're trying to file your taxes online or set up an appointment with Social Security or something, that is much easier. We don't love it because in this instance, the way that it was announced was profoundly incurious, profoundly non-iterative, because it ignored all of the work that had been done in this space over the past 3 presidential administrations to integrate design into our customer services and benefits. It ignored the fact that hundreds of designers and technologists who use agile processes have been fired from this administration. It had a weird emphasis on aesthetics over outcomes that felt kind of creepy overall. As a final matter, design is one of those concepts and principles that is meant to ultimately build not only access but trust. And this sort of dissociative way that this was announced of putting Joe Gebbia in charge without actually mentioning, oh, by the way, we've been doing this for a long time, felt as though it was breaking with the prior administration. Anyway, so that is my it's a drill concept. And with that, I'll turn it over to Erin.
I actually really wanted to talk about the new HIV vaccine this week, which has the potential to improve the lives of millions and millions of people around the world. But instead of that happy note, I thought I would actually talk about some real inside baseball going on within the Department of Defense. There were stories out this week based on a memo distributed by the Secretary of Defense that ends the JROC and JCIDS process. I could tell you what those acronyms mean, but I never remember what they actually mean because we just know what JROC and JCIDS are, which are the sort of joint requirements process, which are mostly been managed by the joint staff and which people, have some feelings about. They are largely considered to be sort of slow and sclerotic, maybe that care about validating requirements and not just letting services spend money willy-nilly, but, I digress. Instead, there is a new process and a new body called the Requirements and Resourcing Alignment Board, which will be co-chaired by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Deputy Secretary of Defense. This, on the cocktail party side of things, is one of several new additions to the responsibilities and authorities of the Deputy Secretary of Defense. There are several things called DERPMs, which I have to say I really like because I think they're kind of derpy, which are direct report program managers. The most, I think, best known of which at this point is the Sentinel program. The land-based ICBM program is now a direct report to the Deputy Secretary. I can get on board with that. That program has had some challenges. In a little bit different vein, they have disbanded the Army's or the Army-led Joint Capabilities Office, which had focused on counter UAS and small UAS. And so that is now a JIADF. Sorry, we are deep in the acronyms this week. The Joint Interagency Task Force 401, which is focused on a broader set of counter unmanned aerial systems and counter unmanned threats with acquisition authority also reporting to the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So a lot of sort of, nitnoid, in the weeds process changes, several of which have culminated in an expanded portfolio for the Deputy Secretary of Defense. At different times, different members of us probably could get on board with that. 2 issues. One, this Secretary of Defense has never worked in the government or in the Department of Defense before, and he's got a lot of other responsibilities already on his plate. The Deputy Secretary, has a lot going on. Second, we have talked before about how the front offices, the personal staffs of both the secretary and the deputy secretary have been, as they say, a hot mess. And none of these additional authorities seem to be rationalizing the staffing of the personal offices or the broader issues in OSD in general. So, I'm intrigued to see how this plays out, but I have a lot of questions about the individual humans currently in jobs who are going to make these things happen. And I'd be, happy to buy them a beer or send them a cheesecake because I think it's going to be a bumpy ride.
Before I turn this over to Rada, I just want to note that when I see the RRAB in my head, I'm just thinking clearly pirates are involved because it's going to be the RRAB.
That's great because I feel like DERPMs are like the onomatopoeia of bureaucratic names.
Yeah.
Like they sound exactly how they feel when you hear them
it's beautiful. It makes me very happy. Yep. All right.
So
Rada.
Mine is probably not surprisingly news related to the trade taxes, aka President Trump's tariff agenda. which notably had a slightly complicated federal appeals court ruling last week that related to his use of reciprocal tariffs. So just for folks to know, he has a bunch of different kinds of tariffs going around. They're under different authorities. I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this, but a number of the reciprocal tariffs are justified under the International Emergency Economic Power Act, the IEEPA, as I like to say. And that, you're welcome. And that is what permits the president to use emergency economic powers, but it's really intended to be emergency because, again, these are taxes and that's a congressional authority. The bottom line is the appeals court said that there was not a significant, unusual, extraordinary threat to justify these in the context of reciprocal tariffs, which are the tariffs he levied against other countries in an effort, if you agree with the administration is approaching as their leverage to get these bilateral trade deals. So the tariffs then it throws into questions whether these tariffs are going to be occurring, whether those tariffs then, if they can occur, are illegal, whether the previous trade deals negotiated, say, with the UK or with other European countries are actually going to stay in effect. And of course, what this means for the broader agenda to levy these reciprocal tariffs and try to get trade concessions from other countries. The small note is that, of course, the sector-specific tariffs, so on like steel or aluminum, et cetera, stayed in effect. So maybe there's a horse trading game to be played there, but it is a big question for the administration's approach on trade negotiation, which if these threats of reciprocal tariffs don't exist, the leverage to push those deals goes away, but also a dramatic amount of certainty suddenly floods into the market because the tariffs aren't subject to this sort of day-to-day deal making between the administration and foreign government. So I guess we'll see / good luck in the market.
This is one of the amazing things that you learn as you've been around government for a long period of time is that a lot of acronyms are onomatopoetically glorious. And you just wonder, like, how much effort did somebody put into that? Or did it just happen because there is a just God? And I actually don't care. It's just like we get the joy no matter what.
It's very satisfying either way.
Yep. All right. Well, that sets us beautifully to go into our dumpster fire segment, which, as a reminder, are bigger stories that are emphasizing institutions that underpin institutions that underpin American power. Another way to say this is that it brings us phrases that one should never say out loud in the English language, like, for example, our first topic on redistricting around an arms race of redistricting. Again, we should not ever say those words. And here we are. So first topic, quick background before we dive into like what is actually going here, what this means. Texas lawmakers a little earlier this summer began discussing what would be a mid-cycle redistricting plan, mid-decade redistricting plan to further gerrymander, let's be real, further gerrymander their congressional districts to gain up to 5 additional Republican seats ahead of the 2026 elections. This is not the first time Texas has done such a thing. There's a precedent back in 2003, and there were some extreme actions, but again, not totally unusual, taken by the Texas GOP and the Texas Democrats in order to face off on this issue, with Texas Democrats walking out, leaving the state, going to Illinois and other places to deny quorum, and the Texas GOP effectively kidnapping one member and keeping her locked in the chamber for a few days in order to force her to be a part of the process. It ultimately passed, but is facing, let's just say, like a lot of lawsuits. So this was the first, the first card on the table of this arms race, where now California Governor Newsom is trying to pursue a special election measure in order to move through their own redistricting play in order to gain a commensurate number of seats. Missouri, facing pressure from President Trump, is considering pursuing a special session, and several other states between Illinois, but Indiana and Florida, which would be to the Republican advantage, and Illinois, Maryland, and New York to the Democratic advantage, are all looking at their options in terms of how they would do this, which notably, nobody would do this in the same way because everyone has different rules, because in elections, it's not Calvin ball where there are no rules. It's I don't know what the opposite of Calvin ball is, where like there's so many rules. So that is the arms race that we find ourselves in terms of resetting the table ahead of the 2026 election. So I want to step super way back. So I'll give you both a chance if you want to add any comments on to like where we stand today. But like this, my big question as a start is, how does this fit in to the overall evolution of districting, redistricting in American democracy in terms of figuring out who is allowed to cast votes and in what ways based on the districts that we set up for ourselves in the House. So either Aaron or Rod to jump in terms of what do we want to add on where we are today, but also stepping way back, how does this part of the overall evolution?
So obviously this is, derives from the principle of one person, one vote, which suggests that, a person in any given location should have sort of equal weight to their vote as anybody else in either a separate state or elsewhere in their own state. So this has implications for how many House seats we have, and then roughly how large a congressional district should be based on that national distribution of House seats. So, when we do a census, there's a reapportionment of, we only have 435 House seats. We talk about whether maybe that's worth, re-looking. But then we have a national population. And so given that national population, how should we apportion those House seats? And the idea is that an individual vote should not be per se diluted. From my perspective, a lot of what we're talking about now is downstream of the Roberts Court decision in Shelby County, which really puts a knife to the heart of the Voting Rights Act, which is what establishes the modern, the late 20th century understanding of one person, one vote, meaning actually also Black people. And actually also we're going to enforce these things and not have poll taxes. And we're going to try to actually have representation that accounts for these various things. Because of course, in the history of the United States, we've had a lot of variation of both who gets to vote, but also the apportionment of those how you count the individuals, whether they're slave or free or whatnot, over time. So, this has always been a political question. It's maybe not always been a partisan question in quite the same way that it is today, but it's a version of who counts the votes is as important as what votes count.
Maybe I'll just add to this two slightly historical notes, which is one, the question of how you draw these districts actually goes back as long as America goes back, because as Aaron noted, this really does drive a number of things, including House representation, but also the how you want to count up a number of things at the state level in terms of electoral votes and the census and all of that drives to that. But the practice, especially sort of post Civil War and through the Civil Rights era, of gerrymandering so that you had majority and minority districts where you could essentially take districts that might have a majority of largely Black populations and sliver them up into a number of districts that then that Black population was a minority within the district, even if it was a geographically contiguous community, was relatively common and a way to dilute those votes and maintain an overall balance of power for whichever party was representing the majority need over the minority need. So it's helpful to have that baseline, because although, as Aaron notes, it did include Democrats approaching this strategy, especially in the sort of Southern Democrat era, it has been largely used for this purpose of intentionally moving away from geographic notions of continuity in these areas of voting and focus really on who is the majority group and how do you maximize those. And so the last piece I'll note is there have been a range of data-driven, air quotes, efforts to try to do this in a, air quotes, objective way, to look at maps and try to figure out what objective or independent districts are. Some states, including, for instance, New York State, have set up rules on how these are done, intended to make it more difficult to do the kind of arms race that are happening now. And so you also end up in a uneven arms race system where some states, and notably largely blue states, have self-constrained themselves to avoid the very problems that are now inhibiting them from gerrymandering in a way that would allow them to take power.
Rada, just to build on that point, which you've kind of started to answer this, as this started happening, one of my initial questions is like, why are they pursuing this, knowing that it's likely to result in retaliation? And also, like, the House is fairly close. I know that they're trying to pursue every edge they can, but why not just pursue their other usual advantage they have in terms of dark money, other things? Like, why this strategy in order to garner the gains that they're trying to pursue?
I mean, I think there are. Sorry, I'll say one quick thing and then turn to Aaron. I think part of it is it's a way to lock in a majority at a time when historically, incumbent presidents tend to lose majority, and right now, a switch in the House would create significant checks on the administration's power, and they don't want.
And my version of it is sort of to establish that they can. I don't know if the president himself is looking to establish that precedent with the Supreme Court, but I very much think that there are people in, his immediate orbit who are. And so you have this precedent from Shelby County from 2008 or 2009. If you can further basically say that partisan gerrymandering mid-cycle is not unconstitutional, then that just removes like another set of checks on, whether you want to call that, sort of presidential overreach or good governance or, consolidation. And it would allow them to, allow majority parties, or, to pursue that, at their own discretion, as opposed to, either moving toward more of a, at one point Iowa, had a system that was all done by nonpartisan, right? We're just going to create districts that are sort of, geographically and economically contiguous, that they make sense, and we're going to fight it out in those districts versus, the kind of the crazy drawn, districts that you can get, in Maryland, for example, but including the new maps, in Texas, which really create these slivers designed to maximize kind of lock-in effect of a particular party.
I mean, I also think that there's a simple calculation of like dollars and time. Post the first cycle after a presidential election, it's pretty typical for at least for the House to swing over to the other party if that's where it had been previous to that. And given where the president's approval numbers are, it's not crazy that it would have naturally done so. So constraining turnout is one way to do that. Or trying to motivate turnout is another way to do that. Motivating turnout's really expensive. Doing it this way is cheaper, or at least potentially cheaper, which relates to my next question of what is this? So, like, there's a reason we do this every 10 years in order to have like a set system for the next decade, and we know generally what to expect, and that allows a lot of baked in planning. But what is this opening the door for in terms of greater chaos or greater changes and variables as it relates to our elections or overall democratic system? Can we anticipate this potentially being a first move to other things, or are people going to try this year and realize, oh wow, that was way too hard?
I mean, I think that's a good question. One of the things we've seen, over the last 15 years, if not much longer. I mean, lawsuits over congressional districts are not uncommon and have a very complicated kind of jurisprudence in terms of what the court rulings have been. And the court has not been exceptionally clear, I would say, over time. They are clearer now because the rules have basically fallen away in terms of pre-clearance and some of the other issues. So I don't know that we're going to get annual, or like frequent, re-looks, because you do end up in a sort of lawsuit situation where, a new map is drawn, then there's a suit, and it's sort of a race to see whether the suit gets, addressed before the next election. But it may give people, incentive to be kind of maximalists on the front end. And then to revise if there's a swing in power, mid-decade or whatnot. I think you end up with, as we've talked about in other sort of circumstances, fights over the rules as opposed to fights for the votes. Whether that's for cost benefit reasons or for other political, reasons. I do think that you would see quite a bit more of that.
And at the same time, this is interestingly, I think opening up the door for greater conversation around some of the structural alternatives that some groups like Protect Democracy and others have been advocating for quite a while, or Fix the House. Some of those include increasing the size of the House or thinking about proportional representation and so on. And so I'm curious from your perspective, some of those that are being floated right now, are those genuinely attractive alternatives that would head off some of the chaos that we're seeing right now? But I think maybe more importantly, is this moment going to allow them to have traction?
Yeah, and I think it's helpful actually to pull apart two things that are happening simultaneously. One is saying, can we make mid-decade or can we make mid-cycle changes in districts? Like, does that make sense? And to be frank, in a period where there's higher mobility than when the rules were initially set, when we see previous conversations on impacts on data collection, but where we have data on people and places that might be relevant. Like, this is not on its face a bad thing. The partisan nature of it, which is the second half, is bad, right? And that makes it kind of whoever's in charge gets to do it. So do some of the changes matter? Yes, like proportional representation, multi-member districts, actually the voting criteria of ranked order voting and other approaches that political scientists will know better than me are certainly valuable process changes that both may make the district shapes themselves more or less salient and could actually help create a more sort of balanced and fair process. I do think that the flip side of that is to Aaron's point, like there is just this is a litigious environment, and to some extent having just certainty and predictability on what the districts are, who's running, what the constituency is, and then forcing the conversation to be out earning those votes rather than changing the lines. Like there's value and certainty there. And so I think there's just some open questions on how you balance certainty versus rule changes to get the maximal.
Lauren, I think that the question is a really good one, because it sort of speaks to, it's like, well, do we want to just reshore the Voting Rights Act, or is there a broader set of institutional changes that we need to look at? And in terms of traction, I'm not seeing traction in sort of like normal America at the moment, but over time we may get a few more observations that help people see that there's some broader changes that need to occur. I mean, I guess I would say that I'm loosely in favor of expanding the House. That would also help sort of water down some of these distinctions. I think there's a huge cultural issue with getting proportional representation. It is just not how Americans have been led to understand their political system, which is, otherwise called first past the post, or winner takes all. That is like a deep American cultural construct, I actually think. But somewhat, really only the other Westminster, systems use that, and anybody who was able to design a constitution after 1870 found other ways to, apportion things. From a broader good governance perspective, I think one of the things that we're seeing is that we have such a strong executive branch, that we need to have some mechanisms where, if we believe that democracies are places where parties change power, right, that we actually allow that to happen. And that it happens in ways where people can, lose once and expect potentially to win again later. And I think we have a couple of major institutions right now where that's really a challenge, both at the Supreme Court. And I think there's some institutional reforms that people are looking at there. But also then, in the House, the Senate's in a similar issue, but a different way because of the way the state lines are drawn. But it has to be the case that people can lose power. And if that's not the case, it's not a democracy. And so figuring out what are the institutions that get us there, I think is the project to be focused on.
And just to close this out, this is one of those issues where the advocates and experts in this space, they've been staring at some of the potential proposals here for a long time and looking at what are the signals and indicators they're going to show this is the moment for us to push this. And it may be, I'm not speaking for them, but like it may be that, like, for example, next year in 2026, if many of these states are still in the middle of a legal fight, and we have pretty chaotic mid-cycle elections, they may say like, all right, this is the time for us to say like, we know advances. And they've had success in states pushing much smaller scale reforms like ranked choice voting or the top two system. But they post that, that could be an instance for people to be able to say, all right, this isn't working. Here are some of the alternatives, and we want to talk to you about them. And there's a reason they've been trying to advance them at the state level, not national level, in order to get communities behind it. But I'm positive we will come back to this as another institutional debate later on. And with that, very different topic. I pitched this on Instagram as an is this capitalism conversation. So Radha, I'm so excited to be able to turn over to you a conversation around like what the hell is happening with our state involvement in the economy conversation at this moment.
Yeah, so this is was certainly an interesting one to read about in the papers and then prepare for this. So maybe I'll just set the stage for a moment, which is a week or so ago, President Trump announced that the federal government was acquiring a slightly less than 10% stake in Intel, which is a Fortune 500 company that's one of the largest American manufacturers of semiconductors, so chips. Particularly notable right now in the AI race, where the chips that are made in many of these by many of these manufacturing practices are critical for a range of computational needs, and flagship legislative item from the Biden administration related to the CHIPS Act aimed at onshoring those. So those are two important kind of tidbits there. President Trump got these shares, claiming that this was aimed at sort of driving and shoring up Intel as an American-based chips manufacturing, but also that the U.S. paid zero for the roughly $9 billion in non-voting shares. So it's a much more complicated deal than it looked like from the outside. It turns out that the U.S. government converted some unpaid construction grants designated from that CHIPS Act to pay for these stocks, but in an unorthodox way. So as a starting point, the government has bought some shares in a chips company. Do you guys have thoughts on that kind of in context and what that means functionally, both for the company and more generally?
I mean, I'll be honest that I've had trouble following like the specifics here, right? So did we actually buy them, or did we coerce Intel into granting the US government shares based on previous funding and threats against the CEO? Just a first order question. Unknowable perhaps at this time. But I think to your broader point, Radha, this is not like a one-off, right? There's actually quite a few other activities going on. And again, some of them are extensions of essentially Biden administration industrial policy. So for example, if you look at the MP Materials deal, which is an effort to onshore rare earths mining and production, that is very consistent with things that I looked at when I was in industrial based policy, at the Pentagon, addressing, kind of a known vulnerability. You also then have the Nippon Steel, the golden share, which again, I don't know the specifics of. Maybe they were written down, but maybe they're like these trade deals and it's kind of not, where the government has a stake, where they allowed the merger to happen between, or the acquisition of U.S. Steel by Nippon Steel, but the U.S. has like this golden share with veto rights. So, one of the things that, gets raised, to my mind, coming from a bit more of an industry perspective, are what money is actually changing hands, for what governance, implications. Are you, and even still 10%, usually puts you in the seat of being, if not the largest stockholder, one of the three largest stockholders, in any given privately or publicly held company. So, what are we actually getting from that as taxpayers, but also like as executive branch, agencies?
And just to build on this question, Aaron, around like what does this actually mean functionally for the company? Because it's one thing, like if you were treating this, if the United States government was not the 10% shareholder and it was random guy named Bob Smith, you would have expectations about how Bob Smith would be integrated into the governance of the company and what it would do. It's the United States government. Are they showing up and voting at board meetings? Are they vetoing specific decisions? Like, how is it they're actually constraining or incentivizing the management of the company, not just overall in terms of vibes, which I think is a big deal, but also day to day. The vibes, though, is not immaterial in terms of what kind of signal does this put into the rest of the markets and how this might be priced into any one company that is thinking about how they are thinking about onshoring or other moves in the United States.
And so let's maybe take those in pieces. So, what you will hear about this is that this is not entirely without precedent. And in the 2009 financial crisis under President Obama, the government acquired partial ownerships of GM and Citigroup and AIG, and that these interventions were justified by both President Bush and Obama as emergency actions that were taken on a temporary basis given the economic conditions. So, is this actually weird? How is this different than bailouts or loan programs where the government is actually either directly in the bailouts case buying some ownership or at least owns is a liability or owns pieces, the company owes back to the government more than just performance in the case of loans?
I mean, I think that the simple answer, building on Aaron's point around this being very mysterious, is that it was transparent. Like we had a set, it was congressionally authorized. We knew what the program was, and it had an exit path. So we knew that at a certain point in time, it would no longer be the case around the United States is no longer involved in this company, or if it is, then the company is gone at that point in time. So like the transparency, the congressional authorization is critical, that like this wasn't just like a unitary thing the executive branch did. And we knew the process by which the United States government would be involved or not involved going forward. Not to say that it was perfect and that it was like a great system, but it was very much oriented around an emergency and not a systems wide change.
And I think that maybe a different way of saying that is, what's the exit in this setup? So the U.S. government apparently now owns 10% of Intel. Are they allowed to sell that stock? Are there restrictions? Or do they sell it? Do they want to sell it? Do they want to?
Do they give pieces of it to cabinet members?
I mean, like what is the mechanism? And related to that, and this was, in some of the background reading that I did for this segment, which is, conditional on what the answer is to what the exit is, how does that impact the existing shareholders, right? I mean, basically, the answer, I think, Rada, to the companies that you listed in the TARP comparison, whether it was AIG or GM, the existing shareholders were wiped out. I mean, there was no benefit to them. It was just that it continued to exist as an agency, and you were able to have a more orderly wind down if that's what you needed. You got some chapter, whatever protections in bankruptcy, but there wasn't really a lot of protection for shareholders. I mean, Intel and some of the other companies that are being, suggested around here have market caps that are, in the billions, and have lots of both individual but also institutional shareholders, to include typically a lot of retirement plans, across the country, state employees and public, other individuals. So, how that relationship plays out, I think, is unknown.
Yeah, and before I turn to sort of how this might affect other sectors, I do think there's the theory of the case here is that this is a way to lock in some leverage from the US government to try to take the money the US government is spending on these companies in the form of grants or funding under the CHIPS Act and shift it. And so I think that leaves open this question, which is like, how is this really different than a CHIPS Act or than funding and contracts for these companies? Why should we think of this as inconsistent with our government approach, especially if you're in the market and trying to read the tea leaves here? And I think that plays out particularly in I'm going to say, whether it was joking or a nod to the desire to do this in other sectors, question mark, and with a particular call out to Lockheed Martin in the defense sectors.
Man, it takes a lot for me to feel bad for Lockheed Martin. Like it's like not a thing that almost ever happens. And it's like, it really sucks that that's the only defense company that he really knows. And so that's like what well, I mean, it came out of Secretary Lutnick's mouth, but like it's too bad. I mean, at some level, this would like get us back to like, what is the point of a capital market and what is the point of issuing stock, which is typically to like raise additional funds than you would otherwise have on your own. And you diversify that, that risk and expand the amount of capital available to you. And you can do cool stuff. That has not how that plays out in the American defense sector is interesting. And there is some tension between, basically U.S. government interests, DoD interests with these companies vis-a-vis the stockholder interests in these companies, which is to have, higher profits and in particular dividends. Defense stocks are actually usually held as part of a more conservative part of a portfolio, especially for institutional investors. And so they want those regular returns, which they're getting because they have regularized contracts. I don't know what a 10% a 10% stake in Lockheed gets you that all of our billions of dollars of contracts don't get you, right? Unless you actually are getting a voting seat on the board somehow or some part of the governance. But honestly, you can write that into, the DFAR or the contract terms, that we don't is a problem, right? And we can talk a long time about that. We lose a lot of listeners, but I don't get what you get for doing that.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just close this out here by thinking about, I will confess my own bias here, which is I think the government is bad at betting and shouldn't really generally have own stocks. I will call myself a relatively old school capitalist in this way. Even I think some of the programs where the government makes bets in terms of capital programs are not always as successful as we want them to be because the incentives aren't aligned in the government. But given that, maybe close out by just thinking about what are some of the risks here in terms of this approach writ large, both for companies and for politics and for government as we think about it. And maybe I'll start with Lauren.
I think so. There's unknowns here because this is, if not exactly unprecedented, it is situationally unprecedented. Where what is this signaling geopolitically? What is this signaling to the market? And what is their reaction going to be? I think a lot of folks are in the confused, unknown, full of cheese part of the world, rather than the I know exactly how to react and here's how I'm going to plan here. But to me, the ones that I am curious about in the near term around litigation risk, particularly given that other CHIPS grantees or other CHIPS incentive receivers, they were part of this. So how is that going to play out vis-a-vis the rest of the market? Is there going to be geopolitical or international retaliation or escalation in some form as people figure out how do I address this? And to Aaron's earlier point that we both talked about here is how are they figuring out the end state here? What is the goal that we are trying to achieve, an outcome and a benefit for the United States government, other than just I have this shiny thing on my wall?
And I guess I would say for the risks, this arrangement is very common in other parts of the world, and it's actually fairly common in other sectors. There was, a whole thing we did about, de-investment from the state across telecoms and airlines and a bunch of other things in the 1980s in particular. In Europe, there are defense companies like Thales and KNDS and Kongsberg and Leonardo, all of whom have pretty rich portfolios in some form of, state ownership. I think most people think that U.S. industry, for as frustrated as people are, is more innovative and more capable than those companies. And so when you have, a government stake, in addition to all the government funding, at least again in the defense sector, I think you risk some sclerosis, right? You risk some, there's less incentive to be pushing the boundaries. There's less incentive to expand your customer base, to increase your revenues, and to be innovative. Part of that is sort of textbook capitalism. But it's why the U.S. markets in all of these sectors are different than their European or Northeast Asian counterparts. And so I think one of the things that really strikes me, in the reading I was doing for this, was this isn't being done because somebody has an alternate theory of the economy, right? This is being done because Trump thinks it's cool to own 10% of Intel. And, if we want to pursue, quote unquote, capitalism with American characteristics, as the Wall Street Journal calls it, I'd like to see a much stronger, as you say, theory of the case. But this just feels very, idiosyncratic at best.
And with that, we'll take a pause here on what's happening with the government owning companies, but maybe come back to this as it evolves over time and maybe even into the defense sector. This week for our interview, we're delighted to have Lindsay Cohn, who is a visiting professor at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, to talk to us a little bit about what's happening with the National Guard, and in particular, in the different states, the federal implications and state authorities for the role of the National Guard. It's a helpful time now to just remind all of our listeners that Lindsay and all of us here are really speaking in our personal capacity with personal expertise and not reflecting the views of anyone we may work for. And with that disclaimer in place, Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Hi, Rada. Thanks very much.
So maybe we can just get started by setting the stage here. And obviously, we're in a time where the National Guard has been deployed a number of times domestically, most recently in the context of U.S. cities. We've seen it in LA, now in the District of Columbia. So maybe you could just start us off by thinking about what's happening here and how does that relate to whether it's particularly usual or unusual.
Sure. Well, so this can go in a couple of different ways. There are the legal questions involved in terms of what authorities are being used to bring in the National Guard. There are the questions of mission and sort of what they are doing, etc. So I'll try and sort of summarize things. In LA, what we had was the president calling the California or some members of the California National Guard into federal service. That is placing them under Title 10 authority, which is direct authority under the president, basically making them indistinguishable from active component forces, and sending them into LA on what was couched as a protective mission. That is, that they were sent to protect federal property and federal agents in the course of doing federal duties. So this was very carefully designed not to run afoul of the no use of federal forces for law enforcement domestically, except where there is statutory exception or constitutional exception. He also, of course, sent some active component people. He sent some Marines to Los Angeles with the same mission set. In Washington, D.C., this is different because D.C. doesn't have a governor. So the D.C. National Guard is already under the president's direct authority. And so the president can call the National Guard up in Washington, D.C. without technically federalizing them. And that's what he did. He called them out under Title 32 authority, which means that they can, in fact, be used for law enforcement purposes, although it's not entirely clear that they are being used in that way. In fact, what we've seen, of course, is sometimes them doing this same sort of quote-unquote protective duty, but also in recent days, of course, the famous pictures of them picking up trash in the national parks and doing some landscaping. So there are a couple of different things going on, but most of it has been couched in a sort of in two different mission states, one of which is dealing with federal immigration law. That's what was, there are some cases of the president sending National Guard personnel to assist to quote unquote assist federal law enforcement agents enforcing immigration law, which is a federal set of laws, not a state set of laws. The other one, though, is this crime fighting narrative, which is what's being used in Washington, D.C.
Can I also ask, just, as I'm not quite exactly a DC resident any longer. I live, 150 feet from the DC line. But we've also seen the deployment or the arrival. I defer to you on the proper coinage of terms here, from West Virginia, South Carolina, Ohio, sort of other states, and maybe other governors essentially volunteering their state level militias, for lack of a better term, to quote, as you say, quote unquote, help in DC. How does that fit into this? That strikes me as less usual than even the other unusual things we might be discussing here.
Right. So when I mentioned Title 10, so the National Guard can operate in three different statuses. They can operate in state active duty status, which is when their own governor says, I need my National Guard to do a state mission. This is usually disaster response or, support to civil authorities in some other sense. Then there is Title 10, which I already mentioned, which is when the president says, I need the National Guard of the states to come and be federal troops, for a federal mission, and then they become indistinguishable from other active component troops. There is a middle status, though, and that's the one that is being used in Washington, D.C. right now, and that's called Title 32. And Title 32 was designed to allow the federal government to pay for the state's militia forces, which then became the National Guard, to do the training and be equipped and etc. to come up to the standard required by the federal government, right? The states were like, fine, you can have our National Guard be a Federal Reserve Force and all. But if you want them to be trained to your national standards and equipped to your national standards, we won't pay for it. You have to pay for it, federal government. And so Title 32 is when the federal government, is when National Guard members are doing potentially a federal mission, but they're still in state status. They still answer to their governors on an operational level. But the federal government is paying for it and is paying them. So Title 32 is usually a training authority, but it can also be used for other federal missions. But those are then voluntary. So if the president says, I need some National Guard troops to help me do mission X, what that could be, pandemic response, it could be disaster response, then governors who want to contribute can say, yes, I will send my National Guard to help do this mission. Governors who do not want to contribute can say, no thanks, I will not be sending my National Guard to do this mission. And that's what you've got going on with all of those ones that you mentioned, West Virginia, Ohio, etc. The president essentially said, I am looking for states to send me members of their National Guard to help with this crime fighting / park beautification mission in Washington, D.C. And if you governors send me your troops, I will pay them from the federal coffers.
Well, that's a lot. I mean, we're very smart here, but I'm not going to be able to keep track of all of that. I have to say, but maybe just as
this is why I concentrate on only one thing in my life.
That's right. Just to follow up on one question, maybe then we'll shift gears into a broader discussion of precedent. Is it normal for that call and response, for lack of a better term, to have partisan overtones to it? Is it normal that a Democratic president gets better response from Democratic governors and vice versa? Or is this again a bit out of character?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's unheard of for it to have partisan valence. A lot of the border missions, so many border missions are done like this. For example, if the president says, I want to increase border enforcement, then many border states will say, yes, I'll use my National Guard for this, and other states won't do it. And that frequently does have a sort of partisan valence, but not always. President Obama mobilized National Guard members to do border security, as did President Trump and President Bush. But it's not unheard of. These things can have partisan valence. Normally, though, these missions are some kind of... So two things I would point out that we are looking at the possibility of something very unusual happening. It hasn't necessarily happened yet, but it could. So one of those things is that normally these Title 32 missions are some kind of disaster response or some kind of... Sometimes they're, things where just the civil authorities have been overwhelmed and they can't respond to something and they need additional capacity for some time. And most of those don't have partisan valence, right? Superstorm Sandy did not have partisan valence necessarily. Although, you always see some governors saying, I don't want, to help a red state or a blue state. Okay. The other issue here, though, is that Title 32 missions, if you're going to send members of a state's National Guard still under their governor's operational control into another state, that receiving state must consent to this. Now, DC is an exception to this, right? Because it's not a state. It doesn't have a governor and it's under federal control. So the president can bring Title 32 troops into DC and DC cannot resist that. But if you start talking about trying to bring Title 32 National Guard troops into another state without that state's consent, now you're talking about almost completely unprecedented stuff.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because you've obviously seen statements in California from the Governor Newsom there on this. You're seeing increasing statements from the governor of Illinois at this point. So there is obviously a strong pushback from governors and mayors in certain cities. And DC's uniqueness gives us some indication about the administration's sort of appetite to push forward on this, what you called, I think, a crime fighting and city beautification mission, which I think is a fair summary. So in that context, what are the, I'll call it rights, or what is the sort of federalism breakdown of powers and authorities between what the administration can do and what governors, states, or cities can do and oppose? Kind of what does that power balance look like outside of the District of Columbia?
Yeah, so this is the huge $1 million question right now. Governor Newsom in California has challenged the president's legal right to use Title 10 troops, right? So federalized troops in California. That decision is still pending. There was, so Judge Breyer heard the case. He issued a temporary restraining order saying, yes, I think Newsom has a case here that the president doesn't have the authority to do this. That was then stayed by a panel at the circuit level. And then there was a bench trial early last month, and Breyer has not yet made a decision on that. So I actually don't know the answer to what rights, what authorities does anyone have. In terms of the way that this has normally worked in the past, the president can send Title 10 troops into a state, but there are very, very few, like I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of times that a president has sent troops into a state against the governor's desires. And in all of those cases, with the exception of Newsom now, the governor has essentially relented. And so, Newsom, as far as I know, is the first one to actually bring a challenge in court.
Am I right in thinking that those were often like federal desegregation cases, Lindsay? Most
of them, all but one of them. So the earliest one was in 1894. That was the Pullman riots in Chicago. And the governor in Illinois, the governor seems to be an ongoing thing. The governor in Illinois was like, thank you so much. I do not need your help. We're good. And President Cleveland was like, no, I'm going to... So this was a case of protecting quote unquote federal property because the railroads were under federal injunction. And also because it involved the mail, which is a federal issue. So he sent in Title 10 troops against the governor's wishes. The governor basically was like, not much I can do. The other cases, as you point out, were all in the 50s and 60s in terms of governors resisting Supreme Court injunctions stating that the schools needed to be desegregated. And in these cases, the president tended to federalize those National Guard personnel in order to get them out from under the governor's control, because the governor was usually using them to block desegregation. So yeah, I mean, I literally 5 or fewer of these instances. So the issue that we have now, Newsom is the first one that I'm aware of to challenge this in court. Pritzker and Moore, the governor of Maryland, have both been making, very, very strong speeches about how they will not allow this to happen. But the point is that no one has ever actually physically resisted it. We have no idea what would happen. Every time there's been a confrontation like this in US history between the federal and state levels, when someone has said, I'm going to send in troops or I'm going to, send in some kind of enforcement, one side or the other has backed down. I can think of at least one incident when it was the president, but most of the time it's the state. And so we don't know. Now, in terms of Article 32, that would be a different kind of crisis. Because if you try to send Article 32 troops, like say the West Virginia National Guard or the Ohio National Guard, it would probably be Ohio given, geography. You try to send the Ohio National Guard into Illinois without Illinois' consent, that is technically an invasion. And Illinois would have the right to fight back. And so again, we have absolutely no idea what would happen in this case.
All right, so let's move from this sort of speculation of, wow, suddenly we are at an Illinois-Ohio civil war of some kind, which that's a lot of speculation for we're recording on the afternoon of Labor Day, to another kind of speculation of, it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and whatever events that are going to happen over the next 6 months have happened. And we've realized, wow, this is a crazy way to run a railroad. And so my question is that, you can imagine scenarios where we're not talking about the Trump administration as against Democratic governors, where maybe you're talking about a unknown administration as against a zombie apocalypse in some way. So there's incentives around whether or not we want the National Guard to be deployed in some ways, and governors may have interest otherwise, but it's switch the political and the values incentives around. And we are, as a society, saying, we should actually have a discussion about what is the role of the Guard that we actually invest in as a national asset, and why are we paying for this, and who does it belong to, and so on. And I would love, Lindsay, you spend so much time thinking about this. I would love, imagine yourself in that 5 years out, 10 years out time horizon. What kind of questions should we then be asking around the role of the Guard, who invests, who controls, and things like that? Because we have this crazy situation right now, but it actually has been more or less fine and made sense up to this point. But there's lots of things behind the scenes that are challenging. How would that 10 years out commission be thinking about rethinking the role of the Guard?
So this is an excellent question, but I think we have to broaden the question a little bit, because the scenario that you're envisioning is one that we've already had in the sense of Reconstruction, right? There are reasons why the executive currently has some of the authorities that the executive has. And it's because in many cases, the states have resisted federal laws that I think all of us would think are good laws that needed to be enforced, right? So so part of the problem here is the difference between sort of good faith and bad faith use of these authorities. And there, I think the main discussion that you need to have is constraints on the president, not necessarily constraints on the National Guard. Constraints on the amount of discretion that the executive has, constraints on the ability of the executive to sort of keep this going indefinitely, things like that. And so there we're looking at questions of, is there a requirement for the legislature to okay one of these the national legislature, Congress, to okay these? Do we have a sort of Domestic War Powers Act kind of thing? Is the president's decision reviewable by a court, right? Is it justiciable? Does the president need to have some objective, like a federal judge or something like that, certify that there's a need for intervention? These are all things that actually used to exist with respect to these authorities. They were removed.
And exist with regard to other authorities, right? Presidential findings, for example, are required for other things.
Exactly. And these were all removed over time. And, again, they were removed generally under situations where everyone was like, oh, the president needs to be able to act fast and all this stuff. But, there is absolutely no reason why those couldn't be put back. So I think, my first answer to your question would be, this is not so much about the role of the National Guard as such as it is about the role of the president. But
I think that's a great point, Lindsay, and ties back to some other topics we've had in this particular episode, which is really around, what are the actual constraints, and what are some of the broader set of institutional reforms we might need to be looking at, 5 and 10 years down the line.
Yeah. The question about the role of the National Guard is actually a big one right now as well, because over time, the trend, if we go back all the way back to the Constitution, right, the idea of the states having their own militias was in order to make sure that they could not be tyrannized over by a central government with a large standing army, right? That was the original idea. And then over time, not only did we turn the state militias into federal reserve forces, but then we developed a large standing army. And then we integrated those state forces into that large standing army. And so the trend over time has been a movement of authority from the National Guard to the federal government, which is not necessarily a bad thing, in the sense that, they are significantly more professionalized, more competent, more capable than they were at the turn of the 20th century. But what we see now, and we saw sort of under the Biden administration and now the Trump administration, is we see governors of both parties, usually in opposition to a president of the other party, trying to wrestle some of that authority back. You saw Governor Abbott of Texas trying to claim that the federal government didn't have the right to issue certain orders with respect to the Texas National Guard. You saw the governor of Oklahoma saying that the Department of Defense didn't have the right to require COVID vaccinations of National Guard personnel unless they were on Title X orders. That is explicitly not the understanding that anyone has had for over 100 years of who has personnel authority, right? But now you've got governors making these arguments and taking them to court, and the courts really haven't ruled on these yet, and now we have Newsom. And again, we don't have a straight answer from the courts on this. But if that were to happen, if we were to see, sort of as part of Lauren's bigger question about the role of the National Guard and should they maybe be specialized for something other than doing what the president wants them to do, after the Vietnam War, the National Guard were integrated pretty fully into what is called the total force concept, or the total force policy. Trying to disentangle that now would be essentially impossible, and would have absolutely staggering implications for our general military capability, readiness, etc. And so these kinds of things, I think that some of these are very, very deeply political arguments. I am a governor of one party and I don't want a president of another party using my troops a certain way. But they could have repercussions that I think most people just have not thought about.
Just as a final question on that point, Lindsay, I have the sense, and this may not be fair, but I have the sense that the governors who are pushing back in this instance now, and those who did so under the Biden administration, are doing so under a very tactical approach that is not thinking about the overall role of the Guard and much more about their own role in their own politics. Are there other democracies that have grappled with comparable debates, comparable challenges like that? Our National Guard versus our permanent active forces is somewhat unique. But are there other democracies that have grappled with similar questions, and how have they managed to come up with, all right, here's a relatively sane balance of how we want to think about federal or national forces versus more domestically focused or regional level forces?
I mean, to be perfectly frank, like the U.S. National Guard is globally unique. There isn't another democracy in the world that I'm aware of that has forces set up this way. And so at a really, gross-grained level, no, this isn't. All federal states have questions of sort of federal versus state law enforcement, and who has the right to take over when it seems like lower levels are not doing what they're supposed to do, and how much the lower levels can push back if they think that the higher level is overstepping its bounds. But we really are in a completely unique situation in the sense that the states of the United States have their own armed forces. And that these armed forces have a dual mission, right? And also have a dual chains of authority. That doesn't happen anywhere else. And so we are sort of on our own trying to figure out how to deal with this.
Yeah, we in our Bombshell era, we spent a lot of time talking about how civil military relations is just a lot like relationships negotiations in terms of you're figuring out how to navigate your marriage, your relationship with your partner, and so on. This feels a lot like we have a prenup that has been going on for a long period of time that is entirely reflective of our ex who gave us a lot of trauma, and we're now dealing with how do we manage and mitigate the results of that prenup and so on. Lindsay, we could probably talk to you. Well, we'll probably bring you back 7 or 8 more times over the course of this administration because God knows what's going to happen in terms of domestic deployment of the military. You are, as always, an incredible resource here. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy talking to you guys and trying to deal with your extremely pointed questions.
We appreciate it too. Thanks.
All right. So as our final segment, the Gong Show, to close out our first month of school theme here, we wanted to, instead of pop culture, to talk about school supplies. And I am curious about what childhood school supply do you still either hang on to or replenish or are just deeply fond of?
I like pens. And that's both like a childhood school supply, but also like a total debater thing. I mean, I still basically prefer the pens that I used as a, high school debater. I like Pilot pens. I like a V7. I now like the grippy grips because I have old lady hands. But I get very satisfied when I get to like restock, a good set of pens. And then I have them in all the bags. I have them in all the desks. It's very satisfying.
My version of this is essentially the adult version of Trapper Keepers.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So one, I loved Trapper Keepers as a child, and you can just imagine.
Did you have the one with the horse on it? I feel like you had the horse.
I sure did. It was purple and sparkly with like glorious. It was like a white horse with like rainbow mane, and it still gives me some hair envy for that horse. But my modern version of that is I like to buy pretty notebooks and folders and then use them for my professional activities, including in the Pentagon. I had a variety of gold embossed, like flowery folders that I would take things from the ugly Pentagon folders and put in on my desk so that my desk would have pretty folders.
So mine is composition books, just like the black and white essay books. I love those. I just love writing in them. And I actually renewed my love of them recently because there is an incredible graphic artist, teacher, thinker named Linda Barry, who has a great book called Syllabus, which is basically based on a series of courses that she taught where you are trying to bring art into the lives of people who are not traditionally artists and getting them to think about art in a different way using a composition book where you sketch, you paint, you draw, you destroy it, you do all kinds of things with it in order to get you to think about art in a different way. So I love the book, but I've always loved composition books.
Well, we are as we ever were.
So with that, we have another glorious episode of Sirens. I'm sure any number of American institutions will continue to spiral or ask what their purpose is or continue to glow gloriously over the next several weeks. So we'll be back in our next episode and see you soon.